Elias Ward stood at the entrance of Azure Crest Resort with a small suitcase in one hand and exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. The ocean breeze carried salt and warmth, but he barely noticed. He had driven 3 hours straight from the city, his back aching from too many late nights at a desk and too many worries about bills, groceries, and whether his son was eating enough vegetables at school. This trip was supposed to be different. A few quiet days by the water before his boy arrived on Saturday. Just rest. Just peace. The resort rose ahead of him like something out of a magazine. Glass walls reflected the afternoon sun, and the lobby glowed with chandeliers that looked like they cost more than his car. He had booked the room weeks ago using a personal account, not the business one. He wanted to see the place the way a regular guest would. No special treatment, no calls from management, just a father on vacation. He adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and walked toward the entrance, the wheels of his suitcase clicking unevenly on the pavement. The automatic doors slid open, and cool air rushed out to meet him. The lobby stretched wide and tall, marble floors gleaming under soft lighting. A security guard stood near the entrance, a man in his 30s with a crisp uniform and straight posture. Elias nodded as he passed, a small acknowledgement, the kind you give to anyone doing their job. The guard glanced at him, then looked down at his phone. No greeting, no movement. Elias kept walking. A bellman stood a few steps away, leaning against a luggage cart and scrolling through his phone. Elias made eye contact, half expecting him to step forward and offer help. The bellman looked at Elias's faded white t-shirt, his scuffed sneakers, the suitcase with a scratch along the side. Then he looked away. Elias tightened his grip on the handle and pulled the suitcase toward the front desk himself. The wheels made a faint squeak as he crossed the lobby. Around him, staff members moved with purpose, but none of them looked his way. It was as if he had walked in wearing a cloak of invisibility. He reached the front desk and set his suitcase down. The receptionist, a young man in a navy suit, was typing something on his computer. Elias waited. The receptionist kept typing. Elias cleared his throat softly. The man glanced up for half a second, then returned to his screen. Elias felt a flicker of irritation but pushed it down. Maybe the guy was just busy. He waited another moment, then spoke. "Hi, I have a reservation under Ward. I'd like to check in, please." The receptionist looked up again, his expression neutral. He scanned Elias from head to toe, taking in the plain clothes and the tired face. His fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, as if the task required great effort. He clicked a few times, stared at the screen, then finally spoke. "Check-in time is 3 in the afternoon. You'll need to wait about 2 more hours." Elias blinked. He had driven 3 hours. His back hurt. His head hurt. He just wanted to drop his bag, take a shower, and lie down for a while. He kept his voice calm. "I understand, but I'm pretty tired from the drive. Is there any chance I could get into the room a little early?" The receptionist shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. Policy is policy. You'll need to wait." Elias nodded slowly. He was about to ask if there was a waiting area when the automatic doors slid open behind him. He heard the smooth hum of expensive luggage wheels on marble. He turned slightly and saw a man in his 50s walking in, dressed in a tailored gray suit, leather dress shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a designer briefcase hanging from one hand. The man moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing people would notice him, and they did. The bellman, who had ignored Elias, suddenly straightened, set his phone in his pocket, and walked briskly toward the new guest. His smile was wide and welcoming. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome back to Azure Crest. May I take your luggage?" The well-dressed man handed over his briefcase without a word. The bellman accepted it like he was holding something sacred. The receptionist behind the desk glanced up, and his entire demeanor changed. He smiled, a real smile, and waved someone over. A staff member appeared with a tray holding a folded warm towel and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. The guest took the towel, wiped his hands, and accepted the juice with a nod. The receptionist gestured toward a plush sofa near the window. "Please have a seat, Mr. Ellison. We'll have you checked in right away." Elias stood there, suitcase still at his side, and watched the entire scene unfold. He saw the way the staff moved, the way their voices softened, the way their faces lit up. He saw the way they treated someone who looked like money, and he saw the way they had looked at him, or rather the way they hadn't looked at him at all. He felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, not yet, just a quiet, heavy disappointment. He turned back to the receptionist. "Excuse me?" The receptionist glanced over, already distracted. "Yes?" Elias kept his voice even. "That gentleman just walked in at the same time I did. He's checking in right now, but you told me I have to wait 2 hours. Can you explain that?" The receptionist hesitated. He looked uncomfortable, as if he had been caught in something he hoped no one would notice. He glanced toward the other guest, then back at Elias. "Well, Mr. Ellison is a VIP member. He has priority check-in privileges." Elias absorbed that. He understood loyalty programs. He understood tiers and benefits, but he also understood tone and body language, and the way people decided who mattered and who didn't, based on what they were wearing. He leaned forward slightly. "I made a reservation. I paid in full. I'm not asking for anything special. I'm just asking to be treated the same way. Is that possible?" The receptionist shifted in his seat. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have the authority to override the check-in policy. If you'd like, I can call the manager." Elias nodded. "Yes, I'd like that." The receptionist picked up the phone, spoke quietly, hung up, and gestured vaguely toward the side of the lobby. "Someone will be with you shortly." Elias stepped back from the desk and waited. He didn't sit. He didn't pull out his phone. He just stood there, his hand resting on the handle of his suitcase, his son's drawing peeking out from the side pocket. He glanced down at it now, and something in him settled. He thought about what he would tell his son when they talked tonight, what kind of example he was setting, and he decided right there in that gleaming lobby that he wasn't going to pretend this was okay. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor. A woman emerged from a hallway behind the front desk, her heels clicking sharply with each step. She wore a tailored blazer, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Her expression was already set in a mask of professional irritation. She stopped a few feet away and looked Elias up and down, her gaze lingering on his worn sneakers and faded shirt. "I'm Marina Graves, the operations manager. What seems to be the problem?" Elias met her eyes. "I'm just trying to check in. I was told I need to wait 2 hours, but another guest who arrived at the same time was checked in immediately. I'm asking for the same treatment." Marina's expression didn't soften. She glanced at the receptionist, then back at Elias. "Mr. Ellison is a VIP guest. He's been with us for years and spends a considerable amount here. Our policies allow for early check-in for loyalty members. You, on the other hand, booked a standard room. If you're unhappy with the policy, you're welcome to cancel your reservation." Elias felt the shift in the air. This wasn't about policy. This was about judgment, about assumptions, about the way she had looked at him and decided he wasn't worth the effort. He took a slow breath. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for respect. I paid for a room. I drove 3 hours to get here. I'm tired and I'm being told to wait while someone else gets immediate service. That's not a policy. That's discrimination." Marina's jaw tightened. She took a step closer, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "Discrimination? You think this is discrimination? This is a 5-star resort. We cater to a certain clientele. If you can't understand that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." Elias didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her, letting the silence stretch between them. Around them, Other guests had started to notice. A few slowed their steps. Someone near the lounge area glanced over. Marina seemed to realize she had an audience, and instead of softening, she stiffened. She crossed her arms. I don't have time for this. If you want to complain, you can file a formal review online. Otherwise, you'll wait like everyone else. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved calmly across the screen. Marina watched him, her expression caught between annoyance and curiosity. Who are you calling? She asked, her tone mocking. Your lawyer? Elias didn't answer. He lifted the phone to his ear, waiting for the line to connect. Marina's patience snapped, her face flushed, her hand trembling with barely controlled rage. Before Elias could speak into the phone, she raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sound cracked through the lobby like a gunshot. The entire space went silent. Guests froze mid-step. Staff members stared, mouths open. Even Mr. Ellison set down his orange juice and watched with wide eyes. Elias's head had turned slightly from the impact, but he didn't flinch. He didn't rub his cheek. He just straightened slowly, his expression cold and unreadable. The line clicked, and a voice answered on the other end. Elias spoke, his words clear and measured. I need you to terminate Marina Graves, effective immediately, and I want the entire front desk staff on this shift replaced. I'll explain when I get upstairs. Marina stared at him, her face frozen in disbelief. Then she laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, full of derision. Who do you think you are? You can't just… Her phone rang. The sound cut through her words like a blade. She pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. Her face went pale. The name on the display read, Executive Office. She answered, her hand trembling. Hello? Elias watched as her expression crumbled. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at him, then at the phone, then back at him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Yes, I understand. She lowered the phone slowly, her hand still shaking. The receptionist, the bellman, the security guard, all of them were staring now. Elias slipped his phone back into his pocket, picked up his suitcase, and walked toward the elevator. Behind him, Marina stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, her entire world collapsing in the span of a single phone call. Marina stood in the middle of the lobby, her phone still pressed against her ear, the voice on the other end repeating words she couldn't process. The executive director's tone had been clipped, final, and utterly devoid of sympathy. She had been with Azure Crest for 8 years. 8 years of late nights, of managing difficult guests, of keeping this place running while upper management sat in boardrooms far away. And now, in the span of 30 seconds, it was over. She lowered the phone slowly and stared at the man who had just destroyed her career. Elias Ward hadn't moved. He stood near the elevator, his suitcase still at his side, his expression calm and unreadable. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. Marina's mind raced. Who was he? How did he have that kind of authority? She had dealt with wealthy guests before, with executives and celebrities who threw their weight around, but this was different. This man had made one call, and her entire world had collapsed. She felt her legs weaken and reached out to steady herself against the front desk. The receptionist watched her with wide eyes. The bellman had taken a step back. Even Mr. Ellison had stopped sipping his orange juice and was watching with quiet curiosity. Marina swallowed hard and forced herself to speak. Wait, please. There's been a misunderstanding. Elias turned slightly, his gaze settling on her. He didn't say anything. He just waited. Marina took a step toward him. I didn't mean to be rude. I was just following protocol. You have to understand, we have policies, and I was only trying to uphold them. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. Elias's expression didn't change. He looked at her the way someone might look at a stranger who had stepped on their foot in a crowded subway, detached, unmoved. He let the silence stretch between them, and Marina felt it press down on her chest like a physical weight. She took another step closer, lowering her voice. "Please, can we talk privately? I have a family. I have bills. I can't lose this job." Elias finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You should have thought about that before you decided who deserved respect and who didn't." Marina's breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that she had been under pressure, that the board had been breathing down her neck about revenue, that she had been told to prioritize high-spending guests, but the words stuck in her throat because she knew deep down that none of it mattered. She had looked at Elias and made a judgment. She had dismissed him based on his clothes, his worn suitcase, his tired face. She had treated him like he was invisible, and now he was making her feel the same way. She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm. "I'm sorry. I really am. Can't you give me another chance?" Elias looked down at her hand, then back at her face. How many other guests walked through that door and got ignored because they didn't look like they had money? How many times did you let your staff do the same thing because it was easier than standing up for what's right? Marina felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. She thought about the single mothers who had shown up in sweatpants, the college students on tight budgets, the elderly couples who dressed simply because they didn't care about impressing anyone. She had let them wait. She had let her staff brush them aside. She had justified it by telling herself that the VIP guests mattered more, that they kept the lights on, that business was business. But standing here now, facing the consequences, she realized how hollow those justifications sounded. Elias stepped back. "You didn't just break a policy. You broke something more important, and now you have to live with that." Marina's knees buckled, and she sank down onto the marble floor, her tailored blazer wrinkling as she crumpled. Tears streamed down her face. Around her, the lobby had gone silent. Guests who had been walking through stopped and stared. Staff members whispered to each other. Elias walked past Marina without another word. He reached the elevator and pressed the button. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, pulling his suitcase in behind him. Just before the doors closed, he glanced back at the lobby one last time. His eyes swept over the staff, the guests, the gleaming chandeliers and marble floors. He thought about his son, about the drawing tucked in his suitcase, about the lesson he hoped to teach. Respect wasn't something you earned by wearing expensive clothes. It was something you gave to everyone, no matter what they looked like. The doors closed and the elevator began its ascent. Marina stayed on the floor, her shoulders shaking. A few guests walked past her. No one stopped to help. No one asked if she was okay. They looked at her the way she had looked at Elias, with indifference and discomfort, eager to move on. She felt the weight of their judgment, and it crushed her. She had spent years building a career, years proving herself, and it had all come undone in less than 10 minutes. She didn't know who Elias was, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had made the worst mistake of her life. The receptionist's phone rang, and he answered it with a shaking hand. His face went from pale to ashen. He hung up and looked around the lobby. "We've all been called to the conference room right now." The bellman reappeared, his expression grim. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. They all knew what this meant. They had all been complicit. They had all stood by and watched as Marina dismissed a guest, and they had done nothing. Now, they were going to pay for it. Marina forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing makeup across her cheek. She walked toward the hallway that led to the conference room, her heels clicking unevenly on the marble. The receptionist followed, then the bellman, then the security guard. They moved like a funeral procession, silent and somber, each of them replaying the last hour in their minds and wondering how it had all gone so wrong. The conference room was cold and sterile, with a long table in the center and chairs arranged neatly on either side. A man in a dark suit stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his face set in a hard line. Marina recognized him. Julian Price, the regional director, someone she had only met twice before. He didn't look happy. He gestured for them to sit, and they obeyed. Julian didn't waste time with pleasantries. As of this moment, Marina Graves, you are terminated. Your access has been revoked, and security will escort you from the premises within the next 15 minutes. The rest of you are suspended pending further investigation. We will be reviewing security footage and guest complaints to determine whether additional terminations are necessary. Marina felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The receptionist slumped in his chair. The bellman stared at the table. The security guard looked like he wanted to argue, but he stayed silent. They all knew there was no point. The decision had already been made. Julian continued. Azure Crest Resort prides itself on providing exceptional service to all guests. What happened today was unacceptable. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of training, and a failure of basic human decency. We will not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Is that clear? They nodded, but it felt hollow. Marina stood slowly and walked toward the door. A security officer was waiting outside, ready to escort her out. She didn't look back at the others. As she walked through the lobby one last time, she saw guests milling about, unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded. The chandeliers still sparkled. The marble floors still gleamed. Everything looked the same, but she knew it would never be the same for her. She stepped outside into the afternoon sun, and the warmth felt cruel against her tear-streaked face. She got in her car and sat there in silence, staring at the steering wheel. Inside the resort, Julian was making calls, already working to contain the fallout. New staff would be brought in by the evening shift. An official statement would be drafted. The guest, whoever he was, would be handled with the utmost care. Julian didn't know all the details yet, but he knew enough to be terrified. Someone with that kind of authority didn't make calls like that unless they had the power to back it up. He needed to find out who Elias Ward was, and he needed to do it fast. The sun had dipped lower by the time Elias heard the knock on his door. He had been sitting by the window for nearly an hour, watching the waves roll in and out, letting the tension of the day slowly drain from his shoulders. He stood and walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. Julian Price stood in the hallway, his posture rigid, his face pale and anxious. Elias opened the door. Julian stood there for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he managed to speak. Mr. Ward, I apologize for the intrusion. I came as soon as I heard. I need to express how deeply sorry we are for what happened downstairs. This is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility. Elias stepped aside, gesturing for Julian to enter. The regional director walked in carefully, as if the floor might give way beneath him. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped in front of him. Elias closed the door and leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. He didn't say anything. He just waited. Julian swallowed hard. Marina Graves has been terminated as you requested. The front desk staff involved have been suspended pending a full investigation. We're reviewing security footage and cross-referencing guest complaints from the past 6 months to identify any patterns of discriminatory behavior. Elias nodded slowly. He appreciated the efficiency, but efficiency wasn't the point. He had built Azure Crest Resort 2 years ago with a very specific vision. He had wanted a place where anyone could feel welcome, where service wasn't determined by the size of someone's wallet or the brand of their shoes. He had hired consultants, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on training programs, and personally approved every policy manual. And yet, here he was, standing in a room he owned, having been treated like he didn't belong. Something in the system had broken, and he needed to understand how. "Tell me something, Julian. How long has Marina been with us?" Julian shifted his weight. 8 years, sir. She started as a guest services coordinator and worked her way up to operations manager. Her performance reviews have always been strong. Elias absorbed that information. 8 years. That meant she had been here before he even bought the property. He had kept most of the original staff because he believed in giving people opportunities, in building loyalty. But maybe he had been too lenient. Maybe he had assumed that new policies would naturally change old habits. He had been wrong. And her training? She went through the same programs as everyone else? Julian nodded quickly. Yes, sir. She completed all mandatory modules: customer service excellence, anti-discrimination policies, conflict resolution. She passed every assessment. Elias let out a slow breath. So the training was there, the policies were there, but somewhere between the classroom and the lobby, the message had been lost, or worse, ignored. He thought about the way Marina had looked at him, the dismissiveness in her tone, the way she had escalated instead of de-escalating. That wasn't just a lapse in judgment. That was a deeply ingrained belief that some people mattered more than others, and it had been allowed to fester because no one had been paying attention. What about complaints? Has anyone reported issues with her before? Julian hesitated. There have been a few, nothing formal. Just comments in online reviews, guests mentioning feeling unwelcome or being treated rudely by staff. We addressed them with coaching sessions and reminders about company values. Elias felt a familiar frustration settle in his chest. Online reviews, coaching sessions, reminders, all of it soft language for avoiding real accountability. He had seen this pattern before, the tendency to smooth over problems rather than confront them head-on. It was easier to give someone a warning than to make the hard decision to let them go. But easier wasn't always right, and now, because no one had been willing to make that hard decision earlier, he had been forced to make it himself. I want a full audit of guest feedback going back 2 years, not just the formal complaints, but the reviews, the comment cards, the casual mentions and surveys. I want to know if this is an isolated problem or a systemic one, and I want new training implemented immediately, not the generic modules we've been using. I want real scenarios, role-playing, accountability measures. If someone doesn't pass, they don't stay. Julian pulled out his phone and started taking notes. He nodded along with every instruction, grateful to have clear directives, something concrete to fix. Elias watched him for a moment, then walked to the window. The ocean stretched out endlessly, the waves catching the last light of the day. He thought about his son, about the world he was growing up in, about the lessons he would learn from watching how people treated each other. One more thing, Julian. I don't want Marina blacklisted. I don't want her name dragged through the industry. What happened here stays here. She made a mistake and she's paying for it, but I'm not interested in destroying her life. Julian looked up from his phone, surprised. He had expected anger, vindictiveness, maybe even a demand for public humiliation. Instead, he was hearing something closer to mercy. He nodded slowly. Understood, sir. We'll handle her exit discreetly. Elias turned back to face him. Good. Now, I want you to send a message to the entire staff. Tell them what happened today. Don't sugarcoat it. Tell them that discrimination will not be tolerated, that every guest deserves respect, and that their jobs depend on upholding those values. Make it clear that this comes from me. Julian finished typing and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He looked at Elias with something close to admiration. He had heard stories about Elias Ward, the self-made entrepreneur who had turned a failing property into one of the most successful resorts on the coast. But he had never met him in person until now. The man standing in front of him wasn't what he had expected. There was no ego, no theatrics, just a quiet determination to do what was right. Julian cleared his throat. Is there anything else you need, sir? A different room, perhaps? Elias shook his head. This room is fine. I didn't come here for luxury. I came here to rest, and that's what I intend to do. Julian nodded, recognizing the dismissal. He walked to the door, then turned back one last time. For what it's worth, sir, I'm sorry this happened. We failed you today, but I promise you we'll do better. Elias met his eyes and gave a small nod. Julian left, closing the door quietly behind him. The room fell silent again, and Elias returned to the chair by the window. He set his suitcase down on the luggage rack and unzipped it slowly. Inside, tucked carefully between his clothes, was the drawing his son had made. He pulled it out and looked at it for a long moment. 2 stick figures, on a beach, holding hands, smiling under a bright yellow sun. His son had used every color in the crayon box, filling the sky with swirls of blue and purple, dotting the sand with shells and starfish. Elias walked to the desk and propped the drawing up against the lamp. He sat down in the chair and stared out the window at the ocean. The waves rolled in, steady and constant, and for the first time all day he felt a small measure of peace. He hadn't wanted to make that call. He hadn't wanted to ruin anyone's life, but he had learned a long time ago that silence was complicity. If he had walked away, if he had accepted the disrespect and moved on, he would have been telling his son that it was okay to be treated that way, and that was a lesson he refused to teach. He pulled out his phone and saw a message from his son. It was a picture of a sandcastle, lopsided and half-finished, with the caption, "Practicing for the beach." Elias smiled, a real smile, the first one all day. He typed back quickly, "Looks great, buddy. We'll build an even bigger one together." He set the phone down and looked at the drawing propped up on the desk. His son had used so many colors, filling every inch of the paper. That was the world Elias wanted for him, a world where kindness wasn't conditional, where respect wasn't something you had to earn by looking a certain way or spending a certain amount of money, a world where people saw each other as human beings first. He knew that world didn't exist yet, not fully, but he also knew that every small action mattered. Every time he stood up for what was right, he was building that world brick by brick. He thought about Marina sitting in her car, her life in ruins. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt tired. He hadn't wanted to fire anyone. He had wanted to check into a hotel, take a shower, and sleep for 10 hours. But the moment she had looked at him with contempt, the moment she had raised her hand and struck him, he had been forced to make a choice, and he had chosen to protect the principle, even if it meant causing pain. He wondered if she would learn from this, if she would look back and understand why it had happened. He hoped so, but he couldn't control that. All he could control was his own actions, his own choices. The sky outside had turned deep purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Elias stood and walked to the bathroom, turning on the shower and letting the water heat up. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes and setting them on the counter. When he stepped under the hot water, he closed his eyes and let it wash over him. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, the knots in his back loosening. He stood there for a long time, just letting the warmth seep into his muscles and bones. When he finally stepped out, the bathroom was filled with steam. He dried off, pulled on a clean t-shirt and sweatpants, and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool and soft, and the mattress was just firm enough. He lay there in the dark, listening to the faint sound of waves through the window. His phone buzzed once more, another message from his son. This time it was a voice note. Elias pressed play and heard his boy's excited voice. "Dad, I can't wait for Saturday. I'm going to bring my bucket and my shovel and we're going to build the best sandcastle ever. Love you." Elias felt his chest tighten, but it was a good kind of tightness, the kind that came from being loved and loving someone back. He closed his eyes and let himself sink into the pillow. Tomorrow, he would wake up, have breakfast, maybe take a walk along the beach. He would check in with Julian, review the audit plans, make sure the changes were being implemented, but tonight he was just a father who had stood up for what was right, and that was enough. The room was quiet, the ocean was steady, and for the first time in a long time, Elias Ward felt at peace.